All right, let's explore this dead idea of foreign aid. What's wrong with it?
Just to be clear, I'm not talking about humanitarian aid, nor am I talking about charitable aid. Those two types of aid have problems, but I'm talking about government-to-government flows, which over the past 60 years have totaled about $1 trillion to Africa. The range of problems is enormous that emanate from the aid model. The obvious ones are things like corruption and the fact that it breeds a sense of a bureaucracy because the government can fund large civil service. But perhaps lesser known are the things like inflation and the debt burden that these economies end up with. And my sort of personal sort of pet peeve is the fact that it disenfranchises Africans, because very often the African governments are spending a lot of time courting the international donors, and they spend relatively little time addressing the needs or the concerns of their citizenry.
Well, how would you describe China's approach to development?
The approach China has adopted vis-a-vis Africa in the past 10 years is completely different from the staid models of aid and development that the West has pushed over the last 60 years to Africa. Whereas the aid-based model is really couched in pity and really doesn't focus on the incentives or outcomes. The Chinese model is very focused on business and entrepreneurial development. It's not to say that the Chinese model is perfect. There are a lot of problems. But in essence, they have been able to do what the West has failed to do in 60 years in terms of providing and building infrastructure and also providing jobs.
Isn't China, though, as guilty as we are of propping up dictators there? There's a lot of Chinese-made AK-47s in that continent.
Look, so these are part of the challenges that are experiencing. However, if you look at the Pew survey from 2007, this is basically an American-based survey organization that had gone to 15 countries in Africa and asked what the African view was with regards to the Chinese. Consistently, over 90%, and very often the response was very overwhelmingly positive, and very often the response, the positive, favorable view of China was higher than that of the United States with respect to giving jobs and opportunities. Now, of course, there's a value sort of model here in the sense that one obviously wants to see human rights in good stead and governments that are held accountable. However, many Africans do argue that it's better to live in a place where you have job opportunities and security and infrastructure, albeit under a despotic regime, rather than living in a situation of squalor and in a despotic regime. So I think that's the comparison that many people come up with.
What are your critics telling you about this?
I guess the most common one is that they think my 5-year plan is too aggressive, which I'm willing to concede. My point there, as I've said earlier, is less about a time. I think we can quibble about timing, but I think it's important for us as a global society to come to an agreement on in a reasonable, foreseeable, credible plan to get Africa off of aid. We need to start that now. It's been 60 years of aid, $1 trillion, and we have not seen any results on the scale that we would have seen after this amount of money has gone to the continent.
Any thoughts on democracy building?
Yes, I love democracy. I think it's important, but I also think it's not a prerequisite to economic growth. I think what you need to see in order to have a sustainable democracy is a critical mass in the middle class. And you only get the middle class if you have economics really fuel an income and people being able to sustain their own livelihoods. So until we get that situation, we're never going to have a sustainable democracy. And without a sustainable democracy, governments you can get a situation where governments are held accountable without a democracy per se. So democracy can come after you get the economic program in place.